Welcome, listener, to another deep dive. Today, we're really digging into an audio source that unpacks some very complex current events surrounding Iran. We'll be exploring some challenging topics:
Mm.
the role of Farsi language media, the recent Iran-Israel conflict, the systematic oppression in Balochistan, and also this shocking mass expulsion of Afghan refugees.
Yeah, and our mission today really is to help you cut through the noise, zero in on the core issues, and understand how these events, which might seem separate, are actually deeply interconnected, part of the whole political and social landscape in Iran. You're going to get some, I think, truly surprising insights that explain not just what's happening, but why it matters, and what it means for people on the ground.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's unpack this media landscape. Our source jumps right into the role of these foreign-based Farsi language media outlets. We're talking BBC, Voice of America, Minota, though that's YouTube only now, right? Iran International, Radio Farda, Radio Deutsche Welle. What's the main critique the source levels against them?
Well, what's interesting here uh, is the claim that these outlets are accused of actively interpreting the news instead of just, delivering it straight. There's even a suggestion, quite a strong one, that they censor news about the Iranian resistance. They're seen as having become sort of loudspeakers for figures like Reza Pahlavi.
Loudspeakers. And you mentioned something about their funding earlier, which sounds like a key part of this critique.
Exactly. The source really highlights the financial backing, like governments funding outlets like Radio Farda, Deutsche Welle, and the BBC. That's seen as directly influencing their political slant. And sometimes, the argument goes, they even push the narrative further than their funders might, sort of subtly, through word choice, guest selection, that kind of thing.
So, tying this together, what does this mean for the idea of nationalism that the source discusses? How does that fit in?
That raises a really important question. The source points to a specific and concerning type of nationalism being pushed. The argument is it's not genuinely for Iran's benefit. It actually serves, and this is a direct quote, dictatorship and reaction. It's even compared directly to the absolute ideologies of, well, Hitler's Nazism and Mussolini's fascism. That's a very stark comparison, highlighting this path towards absolute rule.
Wow. Okay, and here's where it gets really specific. The source talks about Reza Pahlavi's barcode initiative. What was that, and how is it viewed in this analysis?
Right, the Barcode Project. It was meant to connect with Pahlavi's supporters, but our source dismisses it pretty sharply, calls it theatrical, even ridiculous. The critique questions its actual purpose, especially if, as his supporters claim, he already has strong connections inside the regime. Why the performance? It's seen as just that performative, lacking real substance, kind of like that I Give Proxy campaign from before.
Right, I remember that. Okay, and how did the recent 12-day Iran-Israel conflict fit into this whole dynamic?
Ah, that conflict. It really caught many off guard, didn't it? And it definitely polarized Iranian society. According to the source, it forced people to take sides, essentially. Was this Iran's war, or was it a conflict started by the regime itself? The source draws parallels to the Iran-Iraq War, suggesting Khomeini provoked Saddam, and points to slogans like, Israel must be wiped off the map, as fueling conflict. And this is contrasted very sharply with the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the NCRI. Their statement was clear. This war is not our war. They see it as just another chapter in their, 46-year struggle against the system.
46 years, okay. And this leads to something else mentioned, a boycott against Iran International. Who's behind that, and what's the criticism?
Yes, an initiative popped up to boycott Iran International. The accusation is that they're supporting Israel's aggression against Iran. The source identifies some, prominent names and groups involved. People associated with the old Tuda party, Fadian-e-Aghlabiat, various reformists, names like Payman Aref, Fariba Adelka, who's actually a political prisoner in France, Mohammad Reza Shalaipur. He was governor of Ma'bad after the revolution, implicated in those massacres in Kurdistan, apparently. Also Saeed Shahsavandi, Fatemeh Hakechu, Masoud Kodavant. Now, the source criticizes this move, says it indirectly aligns them with Khamenei, especially pointing out their past silence on things like 1988 massacres. The analysis maintains that the real power centers, political, military, economic, are the Revolutionary Guard, Sepa Pazdan, and Khamenei himself.
Okay, so that's a really detailed look at the media landscape and its alleged distortions. Let's pivot now. Moving from media narratives to the actual resistance on the ground. Our source dives deep into the National Council of Resistance of Iran, NCRI, and the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran, the MEK. What's their historical stance that the source thinks is so crucial for understanding things today?
Well, connecting it to the bigger picture, the source really emphasizes the MEK's origins in nonviolent protest. It specifically points to that massive demonstration in Tehran, 500,000 people, back on June 20th, 1981. And the key point made is that the MEK was unarmed then. But Khomeini ordered forces to fire on them, leading to massacres that went on tragically until 1988.
Unarmed, that's a significant point. And their core belief, the source mentions this phrase, a snake cannot give birth to a dove. That really sums up their view of the regime, doesn't it?
It does, very powerfully. It underlines their conviction, held for over 40 years now, that this regime simply cannot be reformed from within.
Yep.
You see it in their slogan from Maryam Rajavi back in 2003, neither war nor appeasement. The third solution, overthrow by the people and the Iranian resistance. That's been their consistent policy. And the source argues that the failures of all those supposed reformist periods, Rafsanjani, Khatami, Ahmadinejad, even Pezeshki Raisi, just prove their point.
That consistency over decades is striking. So keeping that history in mind, how does the source push back against some media comparisons we see? Like, putting pictures of Reza Pahlavi with Netanyahu next to pictures of Masoud Ardavi with Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, that comparison comes under heavy fire in the source material. It raises that crucial question about how narratives get built, or maybe twisted. The source argues, look, Pahlavi is seen cozying up to Israel, a country technically at war with Iran right now. Contrast that with the MEK. They actively opposed Saddam's invasion of Iran. They fought on the front lines, lost over 80 members doing so. And critically, between 1982 and 1986, they were pushing for peace between Iraq and Iran. When Masoud Ravi went into Iraq in 86, he signed a peace treaty, unlike Khomeini, who refused to end the war. Even though figures like Rafsanjani and Khatami later admitted continuing the war was useless, the source even mentions former regime officials like Shamkhani, acknowledging that the MEK was the only group consistently calling for an end to that devastating war.
That's a very different historical framing. And what's fascinating is how the regime itself, according to the source, seems to, well, almost acknowledge the MEK's ongoing influence, even while trying to demonize them constantly.
That's a really key observation the source makes, yes. Despite all the official denials, the regime's own news agencies, Fars, Mer, Tasnim, they regularly report on MEK activities. Things like these rebellious units projecting images of Maryam and Masoud Rajavi onto buildings in public squares. By reporting it, they're implicitly confirming, aren't they, that there's still a strong, organized resistance movement, a movement that stated its goals decades ago. The source concludes that at the end of the day, no matter what faction you look at, even those claiming to oppose the regime, their main target remains the MEK and the NCRI. They're seen as the fundamental threat to the regime's survival.
Okay, so a persistent long-term resistance. Let's shift focus now to a specific region where that resistance is incredibly intense, Baluchistan. Our source details a really concerning situation there, specifically an attack on Gonich village in Kash. What happened? What does it tell us?
The details are quite harrowing, frankly. The source describes armed government agents attacking a family's home in Gonich. This was on July 1st. They were demanding IDs, asking about a son who'd actually been killed a decade ago. Then they reportedly assaulted the mother, who's a respected elder in the community. When neighbors tried to intervene, these forces came back, opened fire on the villagers, made arrests, and then they falsely labeled the locals as Israeli spies. Just shocking brutality.
Israeli spies, and this isn't just a one-off incident, right? The source frames this as part of something bigger, more systematic.
Absolutely. That's precisely the point. If you connect this to the broader picture, the source confirms, yes, this is systematic. Balochistan sees a disproportionately high number of executions. That, the source suggests, indicates a strong revolutionary pulse, a persistent resistance the regime wants to crush. They use tactics like deploying local forces, trying to sow division between different tribes. And the Baloch people face what the source calls double oppression, not just for resisting, but also because many are Sunni Muslims in a Shia-dominated state. They're targeted for their faith, too.
So what's the underlying reason for this relentless oppression against the Baloch?
Well, the source points directly to resources. Balochistan is incredibly rich in natural resources, copper, gold, other minerals. But the region is kept deliberately impoverished. Why? To make it easier for the regime to plunder those resources. So you have this economic exploitation layered on top of the religious discrimination. That fuels the systematic repression. There's even a striking historical note. Under the Pahlavi monarchy, life in some remote Baloch villages was apparently so disconnected, so isolated, people there thought it was still the Qajar period. That tells you something about the neglect.
That's incredible isolation. Yet, despite all this brutal oppression, the source highlights remarkable unity and continued resistance.
Yes, and it makes you think, right, How does a tiny village, we're talking maybe 76 households,
Yeah.
around 293 people, how do they respond to heavily armed forces? The source says almost all the women came out. They set tires on fire, threw stones, actively resisted. And what's really powerful is the immediate solidarity shown. Over 20, maybe 25 different Baloch tribes publicly condemned the attack and offered support. Names like Salarzei, Tamdani, Temeni, Naroya, Josehi, Karamandazi, Sarhadi, Bandehi, Kordi, Korshi, Tarshabi. Just a long list showing this deep tribal unity. And this resistance in Gonich, it continued for over 10 days. That shows incredible resilience against the regime's fear tactics.
10 days. And you mentioned something about the media coverage or lack thereof. How was this event reported?
Yeah, that's another critical point from the source. Those Farsi language media outlets, especially the ones accused of being Pahlavi's loudspeakers, very little coverage, almost none. Reza Pahlavi himself, for example, apparently said absolutely nothing, complete silence, as if it didn't happen. So this lack of attention from certain key media is quite striking. The source notes that the Women's Commission of the NCRI and Mariam Meravi were among the few who strongly condemned the attacks and called for help for the villagers. And some prominent human rights defenders inside Iran, like Narges Mohammadi, did speak out about it on Instagram around July 9th. But overall, limited mainstream Farsi media attention.
Okay, a stark contrast between the events on the ground and some of the media focus. Let's turn now to our final and deeply troubling topic. The mass expulsion of Afghan refugees from Iran, tens of thousands.
Yeah.
What's the backstory here? Why were Afghans seeking refuge in Iran in the first place?
Well, it's a long history, going back 40, even 50 years. Afghans have sought refuge in Iran mainly because of the relentless political turmoil in Afghanistan. You know, starting with Soviet coup in '79, then various religious governments, the rise of al-Qaeda, constant instability. Iran shares a very long border with Afghanistan, over 1,000 kilometers. So it's a natural first stop for many fleeing. It's also historically part of the Silk Road, a pathway towards Europe. The source specifically remembers a huge surge of Afghan refugees back in the 1980s.
Right, so how many people are we actually talking about now, and what's the humanitarian picture like for those being expelled? It sounds dire.
The numbers are hard to pin down exactly, the source admits that. But estimates range incredibly widely, from 6 million up to maybe 11 million Afghans living in Iran. Perhaps 4 million of those might be undocumented. And this recent wave of expulsions is massive. It follows previous ones. About 350,000 were expelled last year. But now, the regime's own figures suggest around 450,000 were expelled in just 1 week, around July 6th. The humanitarian cost is just immense. Afghans are reportedly held in camps lacking basic things like food and water. Often, they have to pay huge sums. The source mentions 25 million toman, which is a lot of money there just to be deported back to Afghanistan. And Save the Children reported something horrifying. 6,700 unaccompanied children being deported. Children alone.
Unaccompanied children, that's awful. This raises a really important question about the regime's own actions and motivations. The source mentioned the regime exploiting Afghans in the past.
Indeed. The regime actively recruited Afghans, especially into brigades like the Fatimiyon and Zeynepiyun. They were sent to fight in Syria, often lured with promises of money or residency permits in return for fighting. So now this mass expulsion is seen by the source as, well, partly a diversionary tactic. They label Afghans as spies to try and shift public anger away from the regime's own problems, its vulnerabilities, and the growing movement calling for its overthrow. The source calls the spy claim absurd. I mean, most Afghans in Iran are low-wage laborers in construction, agriculture. They have no access to sensitive information.
A diversionary tactic? What about the economic fallout of kicking out so many people?
Well, connecting the dots, the source argues it's actually really damaging for Iran's economy. Afghans often do the tough, low-paying jobs that many Iranians are unwilling or unable to do. Think sectors like stone cutting, farming, physically demanding work. So expelling them creates major labor shortages. It causes economic tension. This is despite the regime trying to spin it as helpful, like it's solving unemployment or housing shortages. But the source says employers are already feeling the pinch, facing labor shortages.
So it hurts the economy. And the source also points to something darker underpinning this racism, xenophobia.
Absolutely. It's quite disturbing. The source highlights specific chilling examples, like an Iranian journalist openly advocating for killing Afghans, calling them a virus threatening Iran's demographic future. This kind of rhetoric is directly compared to language used by far-right racist groups you see elsewhere in the world. The source strongly emphasizes human equality, regardless of where someone comes from. It also notes that Afghan children born in Iran are systematically denied Iranian identity documents. It's a clear discriminatory system. And interestingly, the source points out this isn't entirely new. Similar discrimination existed back in the Pahlavi era too. This is all happening despite the UN apparently providing significant funding to Iran, specifically for refugee reception and anti-smuggling efforts.
And what's the international reaction been? Are organizations speaking out?
Well, Save the Children, as mentioned, spoke out about the deported children. That's significant. But the source notes a broader, perhaps worrying silence from major international bodies, like the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, on the overall mass expulsion situation. It also touches on a subtle shift in language, how people are increasingly called migrants instead of refugees. This shift, the source suggests, can reduce the sense of urgency and empathy, making it sound more like a voluntary choice rather than people being forcibly displaced.
That linguistic shift is interesting. Okay, so finally, how does the source connect these Afghan refugees, these desperate people, to the broader Iranian resistance movement we discussed earlier? Is there a link?
That's a really important distinction the source makes. It draws a clear line. Afghan refugees, while they might protest their own terrible conditions, are not seen as part of the revolutionary movement aiming to overthrow the Iranian regime. Their struggle is different. The Baloch people, however, are seen as an integral part of that movement. They are Iranians fighting systematic oppression within their own country, sharing that national identity. Their fight, the source argues, is inherently tied to the larger goal of regime change in Iran.
Okay. As we wrap up this deep dive, it's just so clear how interconnected everything is. Media manipulation, the conflict dynamics, this brutal systematic oppression in places like Balochistan, and these devastating humanitarian crises like the Afghan expulsions. It all weaves together into this incredibly complex and, frankly, challenging reality for the people of Iran.
Indeed. The systematic nature of it all really stands out, doesn't it? From exploiting concepts like nationalism to the violent suppression of minorities, the displacement of vulnerable people. It paints a stark picture, as the source suggests, of a regime focused primarily on its own survival, whatever the cost, often borne by the most vulnerable, both citizens and refugees.
So, to leave our listeners something to think about after absorbing all this, what's a final provocative thought you'd offer?
Maybe consider this. We're all drowning in information today, right? So
Right.
how truly crucial is it to not just seek out different perspectives, but to actively try and understand the motivations behind how information gets presented, or perhaps even more importantly, how and why information gets withheld, especially when we're talking about systematic injustices and these profound struggles for basic freedom. What's not being said and why?